Welcome to the Gaggle Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now, wow, it's quite late now. It's 9:15 on an extremely cold night here in Budapest. We're over the hump. We're over the December the 21st low point in human existence, and so we're now um, heading towards the longish days. Anyway, this is the last solo live stream of the 2025. The next one will be in the new year. So thank you, everybody who has joined us. I really appreciate it. And so I guess not everybody is having to endure cold weather, but that's the terrain. So thank you, everybody. I hope everybody has a great 2026, and all kinds of things that one can hope for. So I look, so Ahmadovich Nash asks, George, what is really happening in Serbia regarding the arming of Albania and Kosovo? Are Vucic's statements serious or just smoke? Well, with Vucic, he's always upping the ante. He's always whipping up kind of fervor, adding drama to the situation. I tend not to take everything he says very seriously. I think that the threat to the Serbs in Kosovo is real. Because they are as an isolated minority in Kosovo. No one really gives a damn about them. Were Serbia to intervene on their behalf, then of course there'd be all sorts of condemnations and so on. But Vucic is really largely a bit of a gas bag. I mean, he likes to create this sense of panic, this crisis. But you always know that he's not actually going to do anything about it. So that's why I always think, oh, he's again, talking about all the huge threat that's faced that Kosovo and Albania are posing. But then, all right, well, what are you going to do about it? And the truth is, he's not going to do anything about it. Now, having said that, you have to also accept that Vucic is the best of a bad bunch, and so I do tend to defend Vucic from those who are always attacking him. These stupid, terrible writers who are absolutely worthless and who are always gleeful whenever anything bad happens to the Serbs and everything bad happens to Vucic. So I always have to defend Vucic from those kinds of accusations, while at the same time, I'm not sure I think very highly of Vucic himself. But I don't see anyone on the Serbian scene who'd be any better. I mean, so all we've had people on here, the Gaggle, getting very excited about these demonstrations against Vucic in Serbia. But you got to be nuts to believe that these people are serious politically and that they're going to bring to power somebody who's really going to defend Serbian interests. I mean, we've been through this before. This is a movie that's already been played before, whereby the people in the streets are really, really defending a Serbian national interest, whereas the guy in power, he's betraying Serbian interests. Obviously, I'm referring to what happened to Milosevic, who was constantly denounced by the more nationalist than thou Serbs. They're really nationalists, and then lo and behold, they turned out to be utter duds who betrayed the Serbs left, right, and center, and were always destined to betray the Serbs. Anyone could have seen that they would absolutely betray the Serbs. Um, and so that's why I don't have any time for those people. I don't have any time at all for the whole sort of anti-Vucic movement. While at the same time, I admit that I don't think that highly of Vucic. I just know that those people are going to be far worse than Vucic. They're basically going to give away the store completely. And of course, in the Serbian context, what does giving away the store mean? Um, that means pushing Serbia into NATO, and that's what it is: Serbia into NATO, and of course Bosnia and Herzegovina into NATO. So that's my view. Anyway, I wanted to start off talking about the obviously the attempted assassination or whatever of Vladimir Putin, and of course we have the Russian claims, and then of course we have Zelensky, and then of course these Western enablers and the Western media, who are of course all dismissing Russia's claims. They're all lies. Russia's lying, 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 and so on. Now, you know, being from the outside, I don't know exactly what happened. However, my go-to position would be that I believe the Russian claims. I don't see any reason why they would lie about this. And I don't believe the Ukrainian claims. And I don't believe the Western media, who are just simply repeating the Ukrainian claims, because I haven't seen any evidence. This war's been going on for 4 years. I haven't seen any evidence that Russians have been lying and making up allegations of things that didn't happen. Who has been lying? Well, who has been lying have been the Ukrainians. Ukraine has committed all kinds of terrorist activities in Russia, and activities that they initially denied that they had undertaken, repeatedly denied, and the media repeated their denials. Oh, obviously this is a false flag, false flag, false flag. It's a Russian false flag attack. And then either Ukraine eventually admitted that they did perpetrate the attack, or the New York Times or the Western media subsequently went on to admit, yeah, I think Ukraine was involved in this. So, by which time, of course, this was already a year later, and so it didn't really matter when you admit, yeah, well, maybe, Ukraine was involved. So that's my take on this. I think the Russians are telling the truth. I think that there was an attack, and I think that Ukraine is lying. The media are lying, and what I think is very interesting, and there I think we don't know the answer as of yet. Maybe we'll never know the answer. Is that if Ukraine were involved in this, as I think they were, who was providing them with the intelligence? Who was providing them with the satellite guidance? Not that easy to launch an attack on Putin's compound in Novgorod. So the Americans, did that happen while Zelensky was in Mar-a-Lago? The British, were the British involved? I think that's a really interesting case. As though who was helping. Ukraine wouldn't have done it by itself. Ukraine doesn't have the capability um, for such an undertaking. So then it was the Americans or the British. Anyway, let's just go through first of all with Lavrov's original announcement, because it was even Lavrov who announced this yesterday. And here's the you see here Foreign Minister Lavrov statements on the night of December 28, 29. The Kiev regime launched a terrorist attack using 91 long range unmanned aerial vehicles on the state residence of the president of the Russian Federation in the Novgorod region. All the unmanned aerial vehicles were destroyed by the air defense system of the Russian armed forces. No casualties or damage were reported. Notably, the attack was carried out during the intensive talks to settle Ukrainian conflict between Russia and the US. Well, that's very interesting right away, because notice how he's framed this as negotiations between Russia and the U.S., whereas the Western media have been portraying, the negotiations taking place between Zelensky and Trump, and then Zelensky and the Berlin Group, and then, and so on. And so that's their negotiations. But Lavrov said, no, well, the real negotiations are taking place between Russia and the United States. And so then you have to say, okay, um, uh, then if that is the case, then it would certainly make sense for uh, for Ukrainians to launch this attack. Now, keep in mind, because again, the media is just so disgusting and ridiculous, like CNN. What possible motive can Ukraine have to try to assassinate Vladimir Putin? Well, in the first place, you answered the question: to assassinate Vladimir Putin. I mean, that's a huge feather in their cap, as they see it. Um, on Christmas Eve, when he sent out his Christmas message, now they're celebrating Christmas now on December the 25th, according to the Gregorian calendar. They've abandoned the Julian calendar, so they've the Gregorian calendar. So it's now December the 25th. He wished Putin death, and of course, so if you wish him dead and you kill him, and it's a huge, it would be a huge coup. I mean, it's obviously a dangerous, reckless act to do. But on the other hand, if you look at it from the point of view of Ukraine and its Western enablers, they think, hey, this is pretty cool. We managed to break through the Russian defense lines, and we hit Putin right in his home. The terrible, horrible, dreaded Putin. There was absolutely that. You don't have to sit there puzzling these things out. Of course, that's the motive, to kill Putin. There's nothing mysterious about this. And they may well think, that, by the by, which is that, well, if you kill Putin, the state may disintegrate. I don't think it will, but it's a reasonable assumption that it will. That's what will happen. So remember, I mean, the sort of thinking, the official thinking since World War II has always been, well, if there ever is an assassination that's justified, it's the assassination of Hitler. In other words, it's always justified to kill Hitler. You're always helping humanity if you kill Hitler. Now, of course, no one did it, there, there were some assassination attempts that were unsuccessful, but they would say, well, that's it. That here's an assassination attempt that you don't even need to justify. Of course, boom, kill Hitler. So that's the same thinking when it comes to Putin. It's like, well, you don't have to justify it. I mean, he's evil incarnate. So the act itself is the justification. And if Russia disintegrates as a result, government collapses, great, fantastic. If on the other hand, let's say whoever takes over from Putin, and it's not even clear who would, because that doesn't. This is why it's always tempting to think of assassinating a political leader, because there isn't any obvious successor. And so, if there isn't an obvious successor, then you might think, well, the place might just disintegrate, because immediately they will start jockeying for power to take over, and that's the time when the state could disintegrate. So that again, that's another justification of why they think this is a justifiable act. But even if, let's say, somebody does take over from Putin and launches, Ahmadovich says, is this a logical U.S. president legitimate target? Yeah, I think so. I think they would. Although people do think it's a legitimate target, but I mean, in this case, so. But let's say somebody takes there's a succession. Somebody takes over from Putin. The leadership, the military, the security, they all rally around the new leader. Well, chances are the new leader will unleash, holy hell on Ukraine in revenge for the assassination of the leader. And in that case, that could well serve as a trigger for a much more direct Western intervention on behalf of Ukraine in order to save Ukraine. And so that's another motive for why you would think an assassination makes sense. Look, assassinations always make sense. I mean, it's just there's no point in even arguing about this. Assassinations always make sense to the would-be assassin, because they always think that in the chaos, the crisis, the possible collapse of the system, then others will benefit. Adversary states benefit, rebels benefit, revolutionaries, neighbors. Everyone's going to benefit from a collapse in the center, particularly of a major power. So that itself is obvious. Now, but I don't see any obviousness in Russia creating this fake story. I mean, Russia doesn't get anything out of this. The only thing that would happen is, the Western media would say, "Oh, it's a fake story, fake news." And false flag. And look, I mean, if you're going to do this, if the Russians were going to do it, they would know that that's how the Western media would react. False flag. And when the Western media would be demanding, we want to see evidence, give us the evidence, show us the evidence, right away, whatever evidence you present, they'll say false flag, fake. This is fake evidence. I don't believe a word of it. So that it just doesn't matter. I mean, the media already had that story that it's a fake, and they weren't interested. Even though, as I said, I haven't seen any past events. When was the last time Russia made an allegation of some Ukrainian attack, and that allegation turned out to be false, and that turns out, oh well, that attack never took place. I mean, whereas we have had a number of attacks on Russian territory that Ukraine initially denied, and the media, of course, denied alongside Ukraine. Um, and then it turns out that Ukraine was involved. Now, of course, as inevitably happens, even when it's accepted that the Ukraine was involved, no one wants to go a little further and say, well, if Ukraine was involved, then maybe Ukraine's enablers were involved, because this was a highly sophisticated military operation. It's very unlikely Ukraine could have just pulled this off without assistance from the Western intelligence agencies. So that's why that's my feeling. So right away, my immediate feeling is that this happened, and Ukraine is lying. But where we don't know, what I think is still a mystery, is the extent of the Western involvement. Anyway, let's continue with Lavrov's statement, and then we'll talk about Ushakov, because Ushakov then did after the Trump-Putin conversation. Ushakov did the readout, and Peter Knopfler says, George, is it time for Putin to stop playing rope-a-dope? Yeah, you could say that again. I think that's why. It's another reason why I'm skeptical of the. In fact, I'm not more skeptical. I don't believe for one moment the story of the Russian false flag is that Russia doesn't need any provocations to launch serious attacks on Ukraine. In fact, many of Russia's supporters for the past 4 years have been asking, well, when is Russia finally going to do something? Well, it's supposed to be the second greatest military power in the world, and it's just sort of staggering and struggling against this much weaker opponent. When is it actually going to take this war seriously? So you don't need any false flag attack to launch a serious war. And moreover, I have to express some skepticism that Russia's going to do anything this time around either. I mean, I know, yeah, we have all the threats. Russia's going to, rain holy hell down on Ukraine. I'll believe it when I see it. Hasn't happened for 4 years, so even on this case, I mean, remember we had the attacks, the Tupolev's attacks. That was in June of this year, and we were again expecting that Russia would rain down holy hell on Ukraine. All the Oreshniks are going to come out. Out come the Oreshniks. But there were no Oreshniks. The Oreshniks did not come out. So I have doubts that is going to happen this time around either. That's another reason why I don't believe the false flag attack story. Anyway, so back to Lavrov's statement, and he says no casualties or damage were reported. Notably, the attack was carried out during the intensive assault of Russian US. Such reckless actions will not go unanswered. The armed forces of Russia have already selected targets and the timing for retaliatory strikes. So you right away, so he issues this on Monday. Monday afternoon my time. And now it's already Tuesday evening my time. Well, since if the targets have already been selected, then why not hit them? But what are you waiting for? I mean, this is the time to hit. If you do these things, this is the time to hit. When you have the right to be angry. You have the right to be, really furious about what has happened. Anyway, he says, despite the attack, we have no intention to withdraw from the negotiations with the U.S. However, given the utmost degeneration of the criminal Kiev regime, which has shifted to a policy of state terrorism, Russia's negotiating position will be reviewed. Well, that's pretty anodyne. Russian negotiating will be reviewed. Okay, well, I'm assuming that these reviews go on all the time. Anyway, this is the. So Trump and Putin had their second conversation yesterday. So we had the first conversation that took place before the Sunday meeting at Mar-a-Lago with Zelensky and Trump, and so before that meeting, Trump called up Putin, and then and we had that conversation. Nothing terribly exciting, but it was interesting nonetheless that Trump decided to have that conversation with Putin before he had his meeting with Zelensky, knowing that what Zelensky wanted from Trump was, yes, the security guarantees. Yes, guarantees that the United States will go to war against Russia on Ukraine's behalf. And so he knew this. He knew that's what Zelensky wanted. So, so before Zelensky arrived, he decides to put in a call to Putin, and as usual, to have a very nice conversation. Now, after that meeting in Mar-a-Lago, which we discussed yesterday during the live stream, and nothing very much transpired, again, Zelensky kept talking about the security guarantees, and Trump just kept fobbing him off. So then we have Ushakov, then had the second conversation with Trump and Putin yesterday. That's an early afternoon Moscow time, so quite early in the morning Florida time. So, and then after that conversation, we have Ushakov giving the summary of this conversation. It says, "Dear colleagues, bearing in mind that December the 29th and the New Year are just hours away, I can mention a detail of some interest, including from a political perspective. This past year, President Putin held 17 contacts with American representatives. This included a visit to Alaska, 10 phone calls with Donald Trump, 6 meetings with special envoys. You can draw your own conclusions about this. Now on to the phone conversation." And then, as agreed, the Russian and American presidents held another telephone conversation today. Donald Trump and his key advisors who were present provided a detailed account of the key outcomes of yesterday's talks with the Ukrainian delegation at Mar-a-Lago. In their presentation, that is, in the American presentation, during these negotiations, the American side aggressively advanced the idea of Kiev's need to take real steps towards a final settlement of the conflict, rather than hiding behind demands for a temporary ceasefire. And Zelensky was advised not to even attempt to gain a respite for his armed forces, but to focus on achieving a comprehensive agreement that would lead to a genuine end to the armed conflict. And that is true, because if you recall the news conference between Zelensky and Trump at Mar-a-Lago, again, the media were asking, well, ceasefire, and so, and then Trump said, well, I don't know, I don't see the point of a ceasefire, because that's just going to, just freeze things in place for the time being until the war starts up again. So he essentially, Trump agreed to the Russian position, which is that temporary ceasefires, they don't do anything. There has to be a lasting settlement, and a settlement that addresses the core issues that that Russia was so concerned with for so many years before it launched the so-called special military operation. In other words, until you address those issues, this war is not going to be settled. So that was the that's been the Russian position. In fact, Trump has abandoned the whole ceasefire thing, because remember, that was initially, he said, oh yeah, we have a ceasefire. He said that last March, and then of course all the Europeans, yeah, ceasefire, and then in the meantime we're going to use the ceasefire in order to replenish Ukraine's arsenal. We're going to keep arming and financing and everything during the ceasefire. So Russia said no, that's a non-starter, and now Trump seems to have come round to that position. So that's why. Ushakov says that. And we'll go back to that. And then says there that next slide. Donald Trump reported on some of the results achieved by Zelensky's team, which are moving precisely in this direction, but which, in our opinion, still leave room for various interpretation by the Kiev authorities in order to avoid fulfilling their obligations. And of course, Vladimir Putin drew the attention of his counterpart, Donald Trump, to the fact that almost immediately after what the American side considers a successful negotiating round at Mar-a-Lago, the Kiev regime launched a terrorist attack using large-scale, long-range drones, an attack on the Russian president's state residence in the Novgorod region. We have clearly stated that such reckless terrorist actions will naturally not go unanswered. The US president was shocked by this news, literally outraged. He said he couldn't even imagine such crazy actions, and as stated, this will undoubtedly impact American approaches to working with Zelensky, whom, as Trump himself said, thank God the current administration hasn't given tomahawks. You remember he came in, in last October. That was the meeting in October in the White House, and before arriving, Zelensky kept the tomahawks. We want the tomahawks. We want the tomahawks. And then again, and Trump kind of fobbed him off. I don't know about that. But this is where I think it's interesting. Here's what Trump said when on this issue, because this was, yesterday was of course a busy day for Trump, because he also met Netanyahu at Mar-a-Lago, and we'll talk about that just after this. But so here the reporters kind of asked Trump about this attack, and of course they wanted Trump to deny that the Russian claims about this attack. So here's Trump.
You know who told me about it? President Putin told me about it. Early in the morning, he said he was attacked. That's no good.
Are you worried that the alleged strike on Putin's residence could stop a little peace?
Yeah, I don't like it. It's not good. I heard about it this morning. It's no good. Don't forget, the Tomahawks. I stopped the Tomahawks. I didn't want that. Because we're talking about, it's a delicate period of time. This is not the right time. It's one thing to be offensive, because they were offensive. It's another thing to attack his house. It's not the right time to do any of that, and can't do it. And I learned about it from President Putin today. I was very angry about it. What? Well, it came out. Well, we'll find out. I mean, you're saying maybe the attack didn't take place. It's possible too, I guess.
Notice again, the reporter is asking Trump, oh, well, maybe this didn't take place. In other words, it's hard to hear, but he's asking, oh, well, does the U.S. intelligence confirm that this attack took place? And Trump, well, I don't know, maybe, but this is what the Russian president told me. So this harkens back, of course, to Helsinki, when again the reporters, well, how can you possibly believe anything Putin tells you? You should believe our own intelligence services. So let's just listen to this again, because this is kind of interesting. This is our fantastic media, which who are never skeptical about anything, except when there's a story that they politically don't like, and then suddenly they want evidence. Give us evidence, and they usually say it about Trump. Hey Trump, wait, what Trump said without evidence.
Maybe the attack didn't take place.
All right, now let me go back a little bit.
Well, it came out. It came out. Well, we'll find out. I mean, you're saying maybe the attack didn't take place. It's possible too, I guess. But President Putin told me this morning it did.
All right, so that's the okay. Yeah.
President Putin told me about it.
Right. So that's the that was Trump yesterday at Mar-a-Lago, and saying, yeah, okay, well, I don't see any reason to doubt it. Why would I? But the media, of course, you can't possibly believe. You can't believe. How can you believe anything Putin tells you? Even though the media have no basis for disbelieving the Russian claims. Anyway, let's go back to the Ushakov's press briefing, and so this is about the tomahawks. Remember, and Trump, yeah. So clearly, that's what Trump did say. Yeah, the tomahawks. So thank God we didn't give him the tomahawks. And it says, Vladimir Putin emphasized that Russia intends to continue working closely and productively with its American partners to find ways to achieve peace. However, Russia's position on a number of agreements reached during the previous stage and emerging solutions will naturally be reconsidered. This was stated very clearly, and the Americans should understand, given the state terrorism carried out by Kiev, Russia cannot act otherwise. This is the kind of conversation that took place, at the end of which the presidents very amicably agreed to continue the dialogue. And then, so here is Modi, along with other leaders. So Modi, who expressed their sympathy and concern for Putin. Modi was one. Daniel Ortega, president of Nicaragua, did that. The president of Iran did that. Maduro did it, and the UAE, the leader of the UAE, also expressed sent out messages expressing their support for Putin. So here's Modi, who also incidentally sent this out in Russian. So anyway, here it says, deeply concerned by reports of the targeting of the residence of the President of the Russian Federation, ongoing diplomatic efforts offer the most viable path toward ending hostilities and achieving peace. We urge all concerned to remain focused on these efforts and to avoid any actions that could undermine them. So that was an interesting. I mean, Modi stepping in like this is he could have kept his mouth shut. And now Zelensky, of course, did his usual thing. Russia is at it again, using dangerous statements to undermine all achievements of our shared diplomatic efforts with President Trump's team. We keep working together to bring peace closer. What has he done to work to bring peace closer? He's done nothing. I mean, he goes to Mar-a-Lago. Before that, he was going to the White House in order to get America sucked into this war. He's not bringing peace closer. Same with the Europeans. They're not bringing peace closer. They want more war. Only they call it peace. This is the usual NATO speak. This alleged resident strike story is a complete fabrication. As I say, now, let's keep in mind, all of the other episodes in the past where Ukraine claimed it's a complete fabrication and then admitted, or the New York Times admitted, that in fact Ukraine was involved. the attack on the Kerch Bridge. Remember that? Oh yeah, it's a false flag. It was a Russian false flag attack, and then it turns out, of course, Ukraine was involved in that. Then we had the attack, the drone attacks on the Kremlin. Oh, no, that was fake. That was fake. It was obviously the Russians who launched that drone attack on themselves. So that was, New York Times reported. Yep, Ukraine was behind the drone attack on the Kremlin. Um, then we had, of course, Nord Stream, where again um, or we had the claims that it was the Russians did it themselves. The Russians did it to themselves. Why they would want to destroy their own pipelines, their own source of income. That was never explained. But obviously, it was the Russians. And then, of course, we know that NATO, the United States was involved, Ukraine was involved, but then, of course, by that time, no one was very interested. It was only interesting as long as you could accuse Russia. And so then, of course, we had the Daria Dugina assassination. Oh, the Russians were involved. It was the Russians who did it. They did it. They killed Daria Dugina. Then, of course, New York Times reports, well, the Ukrainians were behind that, and that was, you remember that article? It was a long article. I can't remember when it was, about the CIA, how the CIA essentially set up the Ukrainian intelligence services, and in that article, it was very long. I can't remember how many words. It was 12,000 words, something like that, maybe longer. And they said basically, yeah, that the Ukrainians were carrying out assassinations in Russia. The CIA, of course, had nothing to do with that. The CIA went through the pro forma attempt to dissuade Ukraine from carrying out assassinations, but they didn't do much with it. So all assassinations that were carried out by Ukraine were carried out by the Ukrainians alone. The CIA was not in any way, shape, or form involved in the assassination. That was the story the CIA put out, and the New York Times dutifully reported it. But what matters in this context is that initially Ukraine denied its involvement in these terrorist activities, and then it was admitted. Of course, Ukraine was behind it. So, that's the pattern. We have a pattern here of Ukraine denying something, and then it turns out, a year, 2 years later, yep, they were involved in this. By which time everyone's already forgotten about the episode. And so we're going through the whole thing. Oh, of course, Ukraine had nothing to do with this, and that this was a false flag, a Russian false flag attack. Whereas in the case of Russian false flag attacks, I'd like somebody to give me an example. Give me an example of a Russian attack that Russia tried to blame on someone else, but that they were involved. When? Give me that one. There's none of these things have happened. I mean, we've had generals. We have repeated cases of Russian generals who are assassinated in Russia. Who killed them? The Russians. Russians kill their own generals. Why would you want to kill your own general? I mean, if you don't like your generals, you don't think that they're doing a good job, you fire them. God, even Stalin didn't go around killing his own generals. I mean, Stalin fired them. Then Stalin did reinstate them, sometimes. But he fired the generals. I mean, if you think the general's doing a lousy job, you fire him. I mean, why would you want to assassinate him? So that that's what I mean. If you look at the track record, no track record of Russian false flag attacks, long track record of Ukrainian terrorist attacks, which are denied, vehemently denied. Media repeat all the vehement denials, and then finally it's admitted. Anyway, let's go on. False flag. Zelensky, the alleged resident strike story is a complete fabrication intended to justify additional attacks against Ukraine, including Kiev as well. Now, notice the nonsense in that. Russia doesn't need any additional justifications. It's got whatever justification it needs. And what does it need additional justification? And particularly to use such an elaborate ruse to justify additional attacks. You already have all the attacks. They're already doing all the attacks. I mean, they're complaining all the time about these Russian attacks. So what other justifications do they need? I mean, you're already saying, oh, Russians are doing this and that and the other. So what do they need additional justifications for? So anyway, typical Russian lies. Furthermore, the Russians have already targeted Kiev in the past, including the Cabinet of Ministers building. Exactly. So if the Russians have already targeted Kiev in the past, what do they need additional justifications? It's an obvious you're contradicting yourself here. They don't need any additional justifications if they've already done it in the past. Ukraine does not take steps that can undermine diplomacy. To the contrary, Russia always takes such steps. This is one of the many differences between us. It is critical that the world doesn't stay silent now. We cannot allow Russia to undermine the work on achieving a lasting peace. And then the Ukrainian foreign minister, Shibiha, says Russian manipulations regarding the alleged attempt to attack Putin's residence are fabricated for only one reason: to create a pretext and false justification for Russia's further attacks against Ukraine, as well as to undermine and impede the peace process. I mean, it all assumes, of course, something that is a false assumption, namely that there's a peace process and that Ukraine is interested in this peace process. Usual Russian tactic: accuse the other side of what you are doing or planning yourself. First, Russia has already struck the Ukrainian government building this year. Second, Ukraine only strikes legitimate military targets in the Russian territory, such as Daria Dugina, bloggers, and so on, in response to Russian strikes at Ukraine, attacks on trains, and so on. Third, Russia is the aggressor, and Ukraine is the country that has been attacked and defends itself according to Article 51 of the UN Charter. There can be no false equivalence between the aggressor and the country defending itself. And of course, the more you talk like this, the more you provide evidence that you were behind in this. When you start talking about the aggressor and the victim, yeah, it sounds to me like you're justifying what you did. And so here is the So we urge the world to condemn provocative Russian statements aimed at derailing the constructive peace process. Ukraine remains committed to peace efforts led by the United States with the participation of the European partners. Now, here, of course, is The Guardian, and as you would expect, The Guardian, of course, dismisses the whole thing. Did Ukraine target Putin's residence, or is Russian claim a ploy to sway Trump? To ask the question is, of course, to answer it for The Guardian. Ukraine has denied the claim and accused Russia of trying to undermine diplomatic progress. So who believes what? And then here, Russia alleges Ukraine tried to hit Vladimir Putin's residence in a mass drone attack on Monday. And then it says, Ukraine has denied the claim, and Zelensky accused Lavrov of spreading typical Russian lies to try and undermine diplomatic progress. And then it goes on, what evidence has Moscow provided? Absolutely none. And on Tuesday, Putin's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said there will be none forthcoming. I don't think there should be any evidence if such a massive drone attack is being carried out, which, thanks to the well-coordinated work of the air defense system, was shot down, he told journalists in a phone call. And then, can Moscow be trusted? In a word, no. The Kremlin and the Defense Ministry often make fantastical claims about the war in Ukraine. All right. Oh, yeah, really? What are these fantastical claims? And what about the claims of Ukraine? What about the claims of the Western powers, such as Russia's losing this war and we're winning? Moscow still insists it never targets civilians in its drone and missile raids on Ukraine, despite regular evidence to the contrary. And there's this editorializing. Says you don't know whether they're targeting civilians. That simply is just made up. Because when civilians are killed in Ukraine, there's often as a result of the attempts to hit the missiles or the drones, and this is debris that hits civilian targets. So that's so to say, oh, the Russians were targeting civilians. Yeah, it may be this building, it's a civilian building that's on fire, but it's not because it was hit by a missile or a drone. It was hit by the debris through bad as a result of bad interception firing. But they say, oh, this is, Russia targeted this kindergarten. Why would Russia target a kindergarten? But if you don't know what you're doing with your anti-missile missiles, then yeah, it could well happen. You're going to hit civilian targets. But Guardian just simply flatly repeats this nonsense. And then, does that mean the drone attack definitely didn't happen? It's hard to say for sure. Ukraine certainly has a history of carrying out strikes deep inside Russia, including assassinations of military figures, drone attacks on oil refineries, and most spectacularly, Operation Spider Web, in which camouflage drones launched from trucks destroyed numerous Russian strategic bombers deep inside Russia. Well, okay. Well, first of all, assassinations of military figures. Military figures are not themselves legitimate military targets. Just simply trying to assassinate a general in his home, or riding in a car or whatever. That's not a military target because it doesn't actually further any particular military objective, which is what a legitimate military target means. It is to secure a military objective. Killing a general doesn't really achieve anything because that general will be replaced by another general. It's not going to actually do anything to affect the military, the campaign. And then leave aside all the cases of assassinating bloggers or assassinating Daria Dugina. Anyway, certainly Putin's residence would be seen by Ukrainian planners as a legitimate and tempting target. So there they are. So now you can see the media arguing against themselves. They're saying Putin's residence is a legitimate target. So why are you denying it? Why are you denying that Ukraine did this? You're saying it's a legitimate target. So if they see it as a legitimate target, why wouldn't they hit Putin's residence? Making the point move just at a key point in negotiations with Trump would be an odd choice, however. No, he wouldn't, for reasons I already explained. It absolutely wouldn't be an odd choice if they think that this would be some great, spectacular triumph for Ukraine in assassinating Putin. But they've admitted here, The Guardian, awful though it is, has admitted here, certainly Putin's residence would be seen by Ukrainian planners as a legitimate and tempting target. Yeah, absolutely, they would, and they did. If it's a false claim, what's the goal? Oh, there are a couple of possibilities. Zelensky has claimed the accusation is a cover story to allow Moscow to strike government buildings in Kiev. Russia doesn't need a cover story, especially as Lavrov has said, retaliatory targets have already been selected. These are all targets that by the Guardian's own admission, those are legitimate targets. If they start hitting military and intelligence buildings in Kiev, those are legitimate targets. Russia does not need a cover story to hit the Ministry of Defense, government buildings. You don't need to. You can say, for the very reason the Guardian said, they'll say it as a legitimate target. I don't know whether it is, I mean, unless it's actually used for vital communications, but nonetheless, it'll be a legitimate target. And I think, we could certainly argue that, and as we'll see, that where the president is involved in making command and control decisions, that's a legitimate target. I don't think it's a very good idea for obvious reasons. If you hit a command and control center, all it means is that the military no longer has any real coordination, and no one knows what they're doing. And that's when you get into a very dangerous situation, because then local commanders don't know what their orders are. They don't know with whom they can coordinate, and therefore all sorts of bad and dangerous things happen. So it's never a good idea to start hitting central command and control centers, because it just means that the opposing army is in chaos, and then all sorts of very dangerous things can happen, particularly where nuclear weapons are concerned. Um, anyway, so that's but as I say, given what the way the Guardian has argued, then you can say, yeah, Russia doesn't need any justifications. They don't need a cover story to hit ministry buildings in Kiev. What they don't need some elaborate fake assassination attempt to start hitting government buildings in Kiev. A more likely scenario would be that Putin, well aware of the theory that Trump is often swayed by the last person he spoke with, was wary of Zelensky's in-person visit to Mar-a-Lago and what might be achieved in the talks. By accusing the Ukrainians of escalation, both publicly and to Trump on the phone, Putin may have been hoping to change the calculus in the US president's head one more time and stave off any decisions of the Kremlin. This is total rubbish. This is all entirely speculative, and there's no need for it, because it was obvious from the dynamics of that meeting in Mar-a-Lago that Trump is kind of sick to death of Zelensky. He's sick of these constant requests that he do this, that, and the other. And he basically, all of the things that Zelensky wanted from Trump, Zelensky didn't get. So as far as the Russians were concerned, the meeting went as well as they could expect. Basically, nothing was decided upon. There are no security guarantees. There's no security arrangement between Ukraine and the United States. No commitment to get NATO involved in the fighting in Ukraine. So, on Sunday evening, the Russians would be quite satisfied with the outcome of that meeting. Anyway, that was then Guardian goes on. Did Trump buy? The early indications are Trump believed the claim and was angered by Ukraine's supposed actions. When a reporter suggested the claim could have been fabricated, Trump appeared to be considering the possibility for the first time. You're saying maybe the attack didn't take place. That's possible too, I guess. But President Putin told me this morning it did. But, the reporter has no basis for making that suggestion. Whereas, but Trump just simply, when we watched that exchange, and I guess Trump's view was that, hey, you can make that claim, but how do you know that it didn't happen? What are you basing it on? The CIA could presumably give Trump a decent analysis on whether or not it believes the claim are true, but reports suggest the president often ignores the findings of his intelligence agencies. I wonder why that is. Maybe because he's getting lousy intelligence from his own intelligence agencies. The very intelligence agencies that gave you Russiagate. Anyway, that was that. And then here's Reuters, which went through the whole thing, and then then said Russia accused Ukraine in 2023 of attacking the Kremlin with drones in what it said was an attempt to assassinate Putin. Ukraine denied any involvement in the incident and accused Russia of manufacturing a pretext for an escalation of the war. Sound familiar? The New York Times later reported that US intelligence agencies believed Ukraine's security services were behind the attack, but that it was unclear whether Zelensky or his top officials were aware of the operation. Of course, that's always the case, the plausible deniability. Well, we don't know. Some of officials believe Zelensky was not aware. Okay, well, they can believe what they like. And then now this is kind of interesting because this is a tweet from this guy Victor. Victor, you know, he has a Telegram channel, quite well informed. And here is quoting Arestovich. Remember Arestovich? He worked for Zelensky. Then they had a falling out, and I guess Arestovich, who was also involved in the negotiations in Istanbul in 2022, and thought that there was a really good deal on the table, and that he was a little surprised when Boris Johnson intervened and the agreement wasn't signed. Arestovich thought that was a deal that Ukraine could have taken to the bank, that was ready for signing Istanbul in spring of 2022. So Arestovich is a smart guy, and here he's here. This is Arestovich issued a short video, and this is really the transcript of what Arestovich says. So it says, according to Western sources, there was a strike. I'm not saying this, they're saying this. Secondly, it wasn't just a residence, it was a special Russian facility designed to command and control the Russian armed forces in the event of a nuclear war. So, in terms of significance, it's like someone attacking Air Force One, the US presidential plane. So, basically, it's command and control the Russian armed forces in the event of a nuclear war. So, it's like attacking Air Force One. As I say, I mean, you could argue it's a legitimate military target. It's a very stupid military target, since you want command and control to be maintained, because after all, who's going to bring the war to an end? I mean, if you get rid of command and control, you get rid of the commander in chief, then you don't really have the mechanism any longer for bringing a war to an end. So it's like someone attacking Air Force One. It's a special facility, an entire city with outdoor structures, underground structures, and all sorts of communication hubs. Here's Arestovich. And then it says, according to Western sources, drones were flying 90 or 91, no one knows, but they were most likely targeting the communication hubs. They're verifying this information, and frankly, they didn't reach their destination, but there was a strike. Why are Russians so outraged? Well, because it was a strike on the command center of the nuclear triad. So that's shades of the attack that took place, the Tupolevs in June of this year. So it was a strike on the command center of the nuclear triad. And the Russian armed forces in general during a special period during a large-scale war. That is, this is an attack on the Holy of Holies. And according to Russian nuclear doctrine and the nuclear doctrine of any state possessing nuclear weapons, this is grounds for a nuclear response. So it's a serious business. Russia will not strike Kiev with tactical nuclear weapons, so this is still Arestovich. This will be a sharp escalation, a change in the entire international framework. They won't agree to that, but the Oreshnik missile could land. I think it's almost 100% certain that ballistic missiles will hit the decision-making center. So that's Arestovich. And then here's TASS with Peskov. Zelensky, Western media's denial of attack on Putin's residence is insane. And then, so attempts by Vladimir Zelensky, as well as by the Western media, to deny the recently reported attack on the residence of the Russian president in the Novgorod region are simply insane. This is Peskov. We do see that Zelensky himself is trying to deny this, and when many Western media outlets, playing along with the Kiev regime, are beginning to spread information that it never happened. Well, of course they are. Peskov said at a news briefing, but this is a completely insane statement. In response to a question from a Western agency journalist regarding the possible public presentation of the attack's evidence, Peskov replied, I don't think there should be any evidence here when such massive drone raid was carried out, after which, thanks to the well coordinated work of the Russian air defenses, many of them were shot down and neutralized. As for the wreckage, that should be left to our military to handle. Now, you have to keep in mind, as I said earlier, that even if the Russians were to present evidence, no one was going to believe it because they're going to say, "Well, this is fake. This is fake evidence, so we don't believe anything the Russians are saying." And so they were, well, that's it. It's so it doesn't matter. You can keep asking for evidence, but when you present the evidence, well, that's not evidence. That could all be fake. So there's very little point to that. So this attack was obviously, I think, Ukraine was involved in this. As I say, I believe the Russian version. Who else was involved? Was it MI6? Was it the CIA? I really don't think Trump was involved. And when you look at Trump's reaction, Trump may well be suspicious that his own intelligence agencies may have been involved in this. So it's like, he's the president, and he's nominally in charge of the U.S. government's intelligence agencies, but he himself really isn't involved. These are decisions that are just taken independent of the president. They can just ignore the president. So we don't really know as yet who else was involved in this. I don't think Ukrainians would have done this by themselves. I don't think they have the capability, and I don't think they would have taken the risk involved. So that was that. That was the one item that which came out yesterday. And then I want to talk a little bit about the meeting with Netanyahu, which also took place yesterday. So as we've said before, with Trump, it's always a kind of a mixed bag. Is that I think when it comes to Russia, I think he's behaved reasonably. I think reasonably commendable. So that was let me find where. Yeah, I mean he's behaved reasonably well. I think he really does want to bring the war to an end. But on the other hand, I think he hasn't behaved well when it comes to Israel. I think he's, we have his own peace plan, his own 20-point peace plan, which, at least there's a basis there for something, for some kind of a return to peace and a normal life in Gaza. Leave aside the Palestinian national aspirations, Palestinian statehood, and so on. Okay, well let's put that off for the time being. At least if we can just end the horror show and the mass slaughter, that would be progress. But it can only happen if Trump applies the pressure against Israel. Because if he doesn't, then Israel is just going to absolutely go rampant and do whatever it wants. I mean, the only restraint, possible restraint on Israel is Trump, and he hasn't done it. He hasn't. Occasionally, there've been flashes of Trump getting fed up with Netanyahu and imposing some kind of penalties on Israel, but then everything just goes back to normal. So we had the meeting in Mar-a-Lago yesterday, in which Netanyahu announced that Trump will be receiving the Israel Prize, which it's, it's rubbish, but nonetheless, well, this is the greatest honor you can get in Israel, the Israel Prize. And Trump said, "Oh, well, thank you very much. Really, what a great honor to get the Israel Prize. I didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, but now I've got an Israel Prize. It'll go nicely on my wall." Anyway, let's just watch a little bit of that the news conference they had yesterday, and here's the here they are.
Netanyahu, Hitler, and compares Israel to the Nazis. Well, I know President Erdogan very well, and as you all know, he's a very good friend of mine, and I believe that, and I do respect him, and Bibi respects him, and they're not going to have a problem. They're not going to have a problem. I know him very well, and you've seen me do things with President Erdogan and Turkey that nobody else could have done. We're not going to have a problem. He's done a fantastic job. I'm with him all the way. I'm with Bibi all the way. Nothing's going to happen. Yes.
Mr. President, are you concerned that Israel is not moving quickly enough to phase 2 of the peace plan?
All right, so this is the question. I don't know if you heard it. Are you concerned that Israel is not moving quickly enough towards phase 2 of the Trump 20-point plan? And that really is at the heart of everything, because I mean, phase 1, no one really doubted that phase 1 will be done, which namely the release of the hostages, release of the dead bodies of the hostages, and release of some Palestinian prisoners. But everything dependent on phase 2, which involved a disarmament of Hamas, the establishment of a Palestinian government, of the Palestinian technocrats, and of course Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. None of that has happened, and of course the arrival of the international security force. So, and in the meantime, Israel has continued to carry out attacks in Gaza. Hundreds of Palestinians have been killed since the start of the ceasefire, and Israel assassinated a Hamas leader. And then when Trump was asked, "Hey, is that a violation of the terms of the peace agreement?" Trump didn't really have an answer. He said, "Well, we got to look at it." And it sounds on the face of it to be, and absolutely a violation of the agreement. But here he's asked, "Well, hey, when are we going to get to phase 2?" So anyway, let's see how Trump answers this question.
Well, I'm not concerned about anything that Israel's doing. I'm concerned about what other people are doing or maybe aren't doing. But I'm not concerned. They've lived up to the plan. They're strong. They're solid. And sometimes they don't understand when somebody violates something that you want to give them a second chance. Well, we'll give them a couple of second chances. But no, Israel's lived up to the plan 100%.
So can you imagine what absolute nonsense? Israel has lived up to the plan 100%. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. And as I say, when he was asked a couple of weeks ago that about was assassinating a Hamas leader, was that a violation of the agreement? He didn't have an answer. Well, obviously he realized that, yeah, it doesn't sound like, that we're living up to the plan. How can you be living up to the plan when you're killing people, when you're killing hundreds of people? Well, I mean, just like, but 100% they've lived up to the plan. And anyway, here we are.
Don't forget, we made the plan possible by taking out Iran. And speaking of Iran, I hope they're not trying to build up again, because if they are, we're going to have no choice but very quickly to eradicate that buildup. So I hope Iran is not trying to build up, as I've been reading that they're building up weapons and other things. And if they are, they're not using the sites that we obliterated, but they're using possibly different sites. We know exactly where they're going, what they're doing, and I hope they're not doing it, because we don't want to waste the fuel on a B-2. It's a 37-hour trip both ways. I don't want to waste a lot of fuel. Okay?
All right. So you see what he's done here. He's now issuing threats to Iran, and you see that little smile, that little half smile of Netanyahu. We all knew that the only reason for this visit, I think this is Netanyahu's fifth visit. I thought it's his sixth visit, but the media is saying it was only his fifth visit. It seems to me that he's already had 5 visits, but okay, it's his fifth visit. Is he wants to rope in the United States for another attack on Iran. Now, the problem for Israel is that Iran can retaliate. Israel does not have the means to defend itself against the Iranian retaliation. We saw that in June. That Israel was very quickly running out of the interceptors, and so Iranian missiles were hitting their targets, and so suddenly Tel Aviv was being attacked by Iranian missiles. So obviously Israel is very concerned about this, because if Iran continues building up its ballistic missile stockpile, it's going to be harder and harder for Israel to launch attacks against Iran. So if Israel does launch an attack, in the near future against Iran, Iran will retaliate. Israel will not be able to deal with this retaliation, so Israel is going to have to go to the United States, much like Zelensky, kind of, hey, help us out, which is what happened when earlier in the summer. So Israel launched this attack. Oh, we can't, Iran's on the brink of nuclear weapons and so on, where we're going to hit Iran. But then, of course, Israel didn't have the means to hit Iran, and so Israel had to call in Trump. So Trump did that. Trump hit those nuclear facilities. He talks about the B-2 bombs, and then Trump was, of course, yeah, we did it. We took them out. The Iran's nuclear enrichment program is no more. But of course, Israel then turned around and said, yeah, well, that's all very nice, but that doesn't really end the story, because Iran has ballistic missiles, and those ballistic missiles can hit Israel. So we have to go after them. But if we go after them, we're going to get hit. We don't have the means to defend ourselves from Iranian retaliation. So he has to go to Trump and tell him that, hey, you have to help us. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because then what exactly is Trump saying here? Is he saying that, well, if Israel decides to hit the Iranian ballistic missiles, the United States will join Israel in these attacks, likely to be quite difficult, because I'm sure the ballistic missiles are well hidden. It's not that hard to hide ballistic missiles. They'll be underground, they'll be all over the country. So it'll be very difficult to identify all of the places where the missiles are located and to hit them and destroy the missiles. So the question is that what Trump is thinking, that he and Israel are going to join hands in launching these attacks on the Iran's ballistic missiles, or does he mean that, well, Israel can launch these attacks on the ballistic missiles, but then the United States will defend Israel from the inevitable Iranian retaliation? Either way, it's a highly dangerous activity. But either way, whichever scenario you go for, what has that got to do with the United States' interests? I mean, this is obviously an Israel project from start to finish. Iran doesn't pose any kind of a threat to the United States. So why is the United States getting involved in this? Just because Bibi wants this? I mean, at least when the issue was nuclear weapons, Trump and before him Bush could say, well, there's a non-proliferation treaty. We can't have Iran being a nuclear power, even though there's no evidence Iran was trying to be a nuclear power. Iran has remained a signatory of the non-proliferation treaty, which of course Israel is not. And so therefore, but at least you can say, well, we have to stop Iran from being a nuclear weapons state. But you can't just launch an attack on Iran just because Iran has ballistic missiles. I mean, the ballistic missiles are there to defend Iran. So attacking the ballistic missiles means you're attacking Iran's means of defending itself. Very hard to justify. So, Trump has a tendency of not speaking very precisely. And so it's very unclear what exactly he's saying here. Well, I got the B-2s, I don't want to waste a lot of fuel with the B-2s. What is it Iran is doing that you don't like? Are you saying Iran has restarted its nuclear program? Or is it that, you don't like Iran having those ballistic missiles? He's very, very, very unclear in what exactly he's saying here. Anyway, here it goes on.
Last remarks regarding the pardon request of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Herzog office told us that you have not talked after the official request of Prime Minister Netanyahu pardon. Can you clarify to us? Did you talk
Which
about
request
it?
are you talking about?
With the President Herzog, the Israeli President Herzog. Did you talk with him directly?
Oh, this is yeah. I can't even understand it. I wish people they ask questions could at least speak proper English. I mean, they have no idea what this reporter is saying. I mean, just the accent is just so awful. Anyway, let's move on a little bit. God, I just find it so annoying when you have a reporter asking a question and the reporter's knowledge of English is absolutely minimal. Anyway, let's go on, because again he comes back to the subject of Iran. All right, here we go.
So we'll see what happens.
How close are we to another operation of Israel in Iran? You said before the meeting with Netanyahu that you are in support of Israel if the ballistic missile project will take on, and also the nuclear weapon. But after the meeting, after what you know from the intelligence, how close are we to another war with Iran?
Well, I don't want to say that, but Iran may be behaving badly. It hasn't been confirmed. But if it's confirmed, look, they know the consequences. Consequences will be very powerful, maybe more powerful than the last time. Yeah. And Iran should have made a deal the last time. I gave them the option. I said, you can make a deal. Do it. I told them, do it. And they didn't believe me. Now they believe me.
So notice again, he's talking about Iran maybe behaving badly. What do you mean? Are you saying that they've restarted their nuclear program? This after Trump has been saying for months that those nuclear facilities were absolutely wiped out by the B2s. Um, and now saying that they're behaving badly, and then he says, well, they should have taken a deal. They should have done a deal. So when he talks about it, they should have taken the deal. Then you have to assume he's talking about the nuclear the nuclear facilities, because there's never been any kind of a deal dealing with the ballistic missiles. So they're talking cross purposes here. Netanyahu is talking about the ballistic missiles. Trump is talking about the nuclear facilities. And he said, "Oh, Iran is behaving badly." What does he mean? Iran is behaving badly? And so you know, now this may be there's a certain method to Trump's madness, in that he's always very imprecise, which means that no one really understands exactly what he's talking about. Um, so Bibi knows that this whole thing about Iran and nuclear weapons was nonsense from the start. I mean, he knows this. He knew even before the June war that Iran wasn't close to nuclear weapons. I mean, he's been peddling that nonsense for 30 years. But the ballistic missiles, that's what he's primarily concerned with. But Trump, this has never been a U.S. core interest of preventing Iran from having ballistic missiles, and obviously it can't, because it would be manifestly unfair. Why can't Iran have? Since when is it prohibited for Iran or anyone else to have nuclear weapons? Anyway, let's go to our the Gaggle locals page, where the Gagglers, the people who support this community, come to comment, observe, and most important, think about the dogs. The dogs who kind of do all the heavy lifting. Keep the show on the road, and who always complain. They always feel they're unappreciated, and so the Gagglers are looking after the dogs, and making sure that dogs don't get too depressed in these dark, cold, miserable times. So thank you, everybody. Thanks to our Gaggle community. Thank you for all that you've done over the past 12 months. Really appreciate it. That you've been with us. You've helped to fund us. You've helped to raise so many interesting questions and suggestions, and so it's really is much appreciated. I can thank you because I was brought up that way to thank people. The dogs, unfortunately, they're not like that. They're usually very curmudgeonly, and they don't like thanking. But I will thank on their behalf. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to Gagglers. I hope next year will be even better than this year. Anyway, Stone River, always very good to see you, and thank you, Stone River, above all. This is a very, very generous donation. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you. Hope you had a Merry Christmas and a very Happy New Year, Stone River. Thank you so much. And Carlos, good to see you, Carlos. Says, dear Dr. Samueli, what do you think was your biggest mistake this year? I think it was when you said Close Encounters. Well, that was all right. Yes. Okay. Let me read this out, and then we can talk about that. I think it was when you said Close Encounters of the Third Kind was a George Lucas film. It's a Steven Spielberg film. It came out in 1977, the same year as Star Wars, actually. Perhaps not important information, but I thought I'd mention it. Okay, Carlos. Thank you for that. I think you mentioned it at the time. And I don't know whether it was you, but somebody mentioned at the time, "Hey, that's a mistake. You got it wrong." Yeah, absolutely. I admit I got that wrong. To be honest, that neither Star Wars nor Close Encounters of the Third Kind was ever my sort of thing, and that's why, because I only really have a hazy knowledge of that genre, I made that mistake. So yeah, you're right. It's funny because I'm not that interested in the genre that I Steven Spielberg. I know his other films, and I'm not a huge fan of his. Um, but I wouldn't make that mistake about his his other works. But yeah, I apologize for making that mistake. Was that my biggest mistake of the year? I don't have to think about that. I'm sure I made a worse mistake than that. I think I made more of a factual mistake. I mean, if I was sort of admitting what's my worst mistake that I made in my life, just intellectually, leave aside any personal things. I think I was taken in, or I wasn't taken in. I didn't believe. I didn't believe that the glasnost. I thought that the Soviet leaders were being very cunning and were trying to outsmart the West by launching a fake move of glasnost and perestroika. And so I was convinced that this was a masterful Bolshevik exercise, and so I got it wrong. That it wasn't masterful, and in justification of my mistake, I have to say I can't believe that any leadership anywhere, any leadership in history or at any time ever, would have just tossed away a country, a power, a standing in the world for nothing. And that's what, I just couldn't believe they would do that. You were the number two power in the world, terrifying everybody. No one messed with you, and then you tossed it away. And to this day, no one exactly knows why Gorbachev and all the people around him did it. It just remains a mystery. So because I couldn't figure it out at the time, I believe that was a ruse. It turned out it wasn't a ruse. So anyway, I think, but that was then. But that was already some time ago. I think that's my biggest mistake, and I still kind of rue my error of that time. But I don't know. I mean, some people have to point it out. Maybe I've made bigger mistakes than confusing Lucas and Spielberg. Anyway, thank you, Carlos, for reminding me of this error. Cynthia, who is our resident, film scholar, film encyclopedist, film critic, with a massive, amazing knowledge of film history and of the film industry. So she provides the Gaggle board with weekly learned briefings about films, about the film directors, film production, actors, and the whole gamut of everything that goes into the making of a film. And it's very, very important because you know back in the day, when we had all these the cahiers du cinéma movement, they made the whole thing of that a film is really, it's the director, it's the work of a director, much as like a novel is the work of the writer, and a painting is the work of a painter. Um, or even musical composition. Musical composition is the work of a composer, and so the Cahiers people, they developed this theory that every film was the product of the film director. And this whole theory started in the 1950s and went on into the 60s. and then they said that there's something called the style of a director, and that every film reflects the style of the director. It was a lot of crap, but nonetheless, there was. It became quite fashionable to think that every film is the work of the director, but of course it isn't. And I think that's the great benefit of reading Cynthia's very learned comments, is that she actually reveals to us all of the complex decisions that go into the making of the film, and all of the different people who are involved. The people with the wardrobe and the sets and the location hunting and the money and the editing. I mean, making a film is a massive operation, and so the idea of just reducing it to a director was always misconceived. And I think that we kind of learn about this from all of Cynthia's extraordinary work and observations. So for Monday night screenings, and so thank you, Cynthia. Thank you all that you've done this year. It's just an incredible amount of work, and it's an incredible amount that we have all learned over the past year, thanks to your contribution. So thank you. Anyway, luckily we also have Cynthia in our live streams, who always has very hard questions to ask, which I don't always answer successfully because they're so interesting and so challenging. Anyway, Cynthia says, I find it paradoxical that Christian de la Mazière, a pro-Vichy aristocrat. So what we're talking about here is the screening last night of the second part of Marcel Aufus's documentary, The Sorrow and the Pity. So we had the first part last week, and then we had yesterday the second part, which is a very long, very detailed documentary about France under German occupation. And this is a very rich documentary, and it bears watching several times because there's just a lot of details, a lot of really interesting material. So both parts are available on Locals Board. So watch them to your heart's content. Part one, part two, and as I say, while you watch, read all of Cynthia's very, very insightful and informed commentary. Anyway, I find it paradoxical that Christian de la Mazière, a pro-Vichy aristocrat, viewed National Socialism under Hitler as a force against both Bolshevism and global capitalism. This only made sense to me after hearing Alex Krainer say that the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution was financed and orchestrated by Western bankers and intelligence who installed a pro-Western government in Moscow that remained loyal until Stalin's purges. If that's true, please expound upon it. If not, please refute it to me. Well, I will refute it. There's been a lot of talk over the years along those lines. The Bolsheviks were financed primarily through bank robberies. They did engage in robberies. They did have some patrons, but the notion that they were financed by Wall Street is utter nonsense. There's never been any evidence of this. There was a book written by name escapes me. It was written, I think, sometime in 1974, which made the claim that somehow Wall Street financed the Bolsheviks, and it's just untrue. Now, what is true is that the Bolsheviks were financed during World War I by the Imperial Germany. And so Imperial Germany had this guy, Alexander Helphand, who was their kind of liaison between the German government and the Bolsheviks. So he was this Jewish socialist, Alexander Helphand, known as Fatty Parvus. and he channeled money from the imperial German government to the Bolsheviks. But the Bolsheviks were not pro-Western. If they were pro-Western, why would the Western powers have intervened from 1918 through till about 1920, when they had intervened in the civil war in Russia in order to defeat the Bolsheviks? So it doesn't make any sense. I mean, if the Bolsheviks were seen to be the creatures of the West, why was there an Allied intervention to crush the Bolshevik Revolution? And remember, the Bolshevik Revolution, the only reason the Allied intervention failed was that it became very unpopular at home, and that even in Britain, and there was no, this is not a communist country. Even in Britain, there were mass protests against sending Allied ships to Russia. There was Ernie Bevin, who was a famous anti-communist trade union leader. Ernie Bevin, led the protests in 1920 to against these sending these ships of arms to Russia in order to crush the Bolshevik Revolution. It was I think, what was it called? The Jolly George, I think, of the ships that they were protesting. So that was Ernie Bevin. I mean, you can't get more anti-communist than Ernie Bevin, but even he was protesting about the Allied intervention in Russia against the Bolsheviks. So as I say, there was this book was written in 1974. What's the name of that author? And he really didn't even have a thesis. There was one Wall Street guy, some Jewish guy, that he claimed sent money to the Bolsheviks. That was it. That was the sum and substance of his claim that Wall Street had financed the Bolshevik Revolution. But as I say, that part is, I think, untrue. Even if there may have been, one or two Jewish guys who were filled with hatred for the Tsarist regime, and out of hatred for the Tsarist regime, they sent money to the Bolsheviks. There may have been a little bit of that. But that doesn't mean Wall Street financed Lenin. I mean, it's nonsense. But that is, without question, that has been a meme that's gone on for years, and helped fuel a lot of the sort of the fascist movements in the idea that somehow the capitalists were really financing the Bolsheviks. Now, one way that the fascists, but particularly with the National Socialist movement, one way that they did that is by saying, well, the capitalists are Jews, or at least a high preponderance of capitalists are Jews, a high preponderance of the Bolsheviks in Russia, but above all the Bolsheviks in other countries, the Bolsheviks in Hungary, the Bolsheviks in Germany, they were Jews. So basically, we have Jews on one side, we have Jews on the other side. Well, what do they have in common? Well, they're Jews and they want to rule the world. And so that fueled the whole kind of thesis, that the anti-Semitic thesis that, of course, helped propel Hitler to power, that that we were being destroyed by the Jews. You're either being sucked dry by the Jewish capitalists, or you were being slaughtered by the Jewish communists, and they're all in on it together. So it looks on the face of it that they're antagonists, but in reality they were one and the same. Well, it wasn't true. Just wasn't true. But it's a nice thesis. Now, it's not true to say that that the Western bankers' intelligence and said this was pro-Western. There was the Bolshevik Revolution was not pro-Western. If it was so pro-Western, how come the United States did not recognize the Bolshevik regime until 1933? So, in other words, the Bolsheviks had won the Civil War by 1921, they'd already won the Civil War. So 12 years, it took 12 years before the the fount of world capitalism, which is the United States, actually recognized the Bolshevik regime in Russia. Now, the British and the French did recognize it a little bit earlier, but not till sometime in the 1920s. Why did they hesitate if they were so pro-Western? And then, in any case, even after the British recognized the Bolshevik regime, they broke off diplomatic relations over the Zinoviev letter, kind of nonsensical. So that didn't happen. Now, that's not to say that that this theory, just continued through its own momentum, because it's very nice. It's well, the Jews are very clever. They're in on it. Communist capitalists. They're pretending they have a kind of a Punch and Judy show. In reality, they're all on the same side because they're all Jews. It's a wonderful circular argument. Well, since they're Jews, they must obviously be on the same side. So therefore, the communists and the capitalists must be batting on the same team. So this was the 1920s. So even before, now, yes, there was a brief period during the 1920s, the Lenins, during the new economic policy, because basically the war communism had been so devastating in Russia that they needed to introduce some kind of controlled capitalism. And so there was the new economic policy, which they experimented for a few years. And then they brought it to an end. They brought it to an end long before the Stalin's purges. Stalin's purges don't start until the mid-1930s. The new economic policy came to an end in 1927. So the purges didn't start till 5 or 6 years later after that. But the new economic policy came to an end with Stalin's first 5-year plan, because that basically just ended the whole brief kind of controlled capitalist experiment. And they ended it for the very reason that you can't have communism coexisting with capitalism, because if you coexist with the capitalists, soon the capitalists are going to take over. I mean, in no time at all, you're gonna create a bourgeois class. You're going to create these rich peasants, and they're going to be these rich peasants. They're going to want a bourgeois capitalist system in place, and that'll be the end of the communists. And they're obviously going to kick the communists out of power. So the Communist Party had to make a decision. Well, what are we going to do? Are we going to just basically allow our rule to be liquidated by continuing with the new economic policy, or are we actually going to be serious and try to introduce communism? They decided we're going to be serious. We're going to try and introduce communism. As I say, that was in 1927. That's when they did the whole collectivization of agriculture and the crash industrialization. But the whole idea of this was being run by Wall Street is just sorry. I mean, this is just absolutely. It's a load of codswallop. It's just people who want to believe in conspiracies. To answer all questions. And as I say, there's never been any serious evidence of Western capitalist support for the Bolsheviks. As I say, there was this book in the 1970s. This guy dug up some guy in Wall Street who gave money to the Bolsheviks. Okay, that's one guy. He was on Wall Street. He gave money to the Bolsheviks. But who really did finance the Bolsheviks was Imperial Germany. And Imperial Germany had its own reasons for doing it. And it was a very shrewd investment, because the Bolsheviks essentially destroyed the Russian army through their agitation and propaganda. They did exactly what the Germans wanted them to do. So that was money well spent, but that wasn't because they were capitalists or they wanted, to introduce capitalism in Russia. They wanted to destroy the Russian army. This is what this guy, this fatty parvus, Alexander Helphand, he kind of told them, hey, these Bolsheviks, they are ruthless. They're really good at what they do. You give them enough money, and they will destroy the Russian Imperial Army, and that's exactly what happened, and hence the Russian collapse in 1917. But that was Imperial Germany. Imperial Germany had no intention of allowing the Bolsheviks to stay in power. That was, once their mission was accomplished, and the Russian army collapsed, then then of course they would have thrown the Bolsheviks out. So anyway, that was, I think you said please refute it to me. I hope I've done that. Anyway, Cynthia goes on. Although I was aware that Hitler persecuted Jews, Roma, communists, including exiled Spanish Republicans, I didn't realize that Freemasons were also targeted. Yeah, the Freemasons also were always regarded as Jews and kind of revolutionaries. So yeah, that's right. This was mentioned repeatedly by several interviewees in the film last night. Was Nazi persecution of Freemason linked to the belief that they played in the Bolshevik Revolution? No, I think it's more that they are they are Jews, and inherently they are revolutionaries. So they're kind of free thinkers and a thoroughly destructive force. So they're always, Freemasons were absolutely always targeted, particularly by the kind of European conservative movement that emerged during the 19th century. So in reaction, obviously, against the French Revolution. So you had this European conservative movement, serious conservative movement. I mean, this is not like the British Tories, but Charles Maurras, and Hippolyte Taine and others. They really were against the ideas of the French Revolution, and they were always targeting the Freemasons. So the Nazis kind of took this over from them. The Nazis, of course, were not conservatives in any sense, but they took over some of the ideas and ideology of that kind of European conservatism, monarchists, Catholics, authoritarians. That was the watchword of this the European conservatives movement, Action Française, and the rest. That was Marat. Kind of serious conservatism, but they were always against the Freemasons. They always regard the Freemasons were absolutely the enemy, because they were trying to destroy the old order. They were destroying the monarchy. They were obviously destroying the Roman Catholic Church. So if we're going to restore a kind of hierarchical, authoritarian, traditionalist society, we need to remove the Freemasons. So the fascists simply took this over from the Action Française type people. Anyway, so I didn't realize the Freemason war target. This was mentioned repeatedly by several interviewees in the film last night. Was Nazi persecution? Yeah, that's right. The government, but then it says played a role in particularly in the claim that Western financial intelligence helped install a pro-Western government in Moscow before Stalin later put it. So as I say, when it comes to Hitler, Hitler did not think, and the Nazis did not think, that the Bolshevik Revolution had been installed by the West. On the contrary, Hitler's idea was that he would organize Europe in a crusade against Bolshevism. He thought that the British hated the Bolsheviks as much as he did. He thought that the French hated the Bolsheviks as much as he did. So he thought that, well, the way we can organize this crusade against the Bolsheviks is by rallying with the capitalist powers. So Hitler was not an enemy of the capitalists. He thought that for the capitalist powers, what was a rational decision for them was to join in this crusade against the Bolsheviks. And that's what he planned. That was his original plan when he came to power, and which is why he made nice with the West. He made nice with the British. He made nice with the French. He made nice with the Poles, because he was always planning this crusade against Bolshevism. He wouldn't have done it if he thought that the Bolsheviks were somehow in cahoots with the capitalists. Now the plan failed, and that's a fascinating issue as to why Hitler's plan failed. Why the Western powers didn't go for Hitler's plan, because the Western powers absolutely hated the Bolsheviks as much as, if not more, than he did. So the British absolutely hated the Bolsheviks, and as we can see by the extremely hostile policy towards the Soviet Union leading up to World War II, and then the resumption of their hostile policy immediately after World War II. Why in World War II they sided with the Bolsheviks against Hitler? That's a very, very interesting story, but a mystery. It's not immediately obvious why they did, why they regarded Hitler as more of a threat than the Soviet Union. But Hitler wasn't expecting it. Hitler thought that Germany would be a natural ally of Britain's against Soviet Russia. Um, so I think so. That was so Hitler absolutely never believed that Stalin was working for London. Anyway, so that was so. Then Cynthia goes on. I find it also puzzling that Colonel Raymond Dujonchet, 1900 to 1991, a committed monarchist, see, these are the monarchists, became a leader in the French resistance. Given Nazi Germany's apparent sympathy for the aristocratic empires, okay, all right, one might have expected someone with his views to side with Vichy rather than the resistance. Particularly since he was deeply opposed not only to communism, but also to Gaullist socialism. Well, I mean, there's a really interesting question. Now, what I would say is that the Nazis, the Nazis really were not conservatives. They were not monarchists. They were not Catholics. They were not celebrators of hierarchy, tradition, and the old order. They may have used some of the ideas and some of the slogans, as I said, of the kind of European conservative movement, that began to develop in Europe during the late 19th century. They seized on those ideas, but they themselves were actually very anti-conservative, very anti-monarchist, against the church, against Christianity. So they were actually quite radical in their view. So it would make, Hitler had no intention of restoring the Hohenzollerns in Germany. He had no interest at all in restoring any of the German monarchies. I mean, Germany was riddled with all these monarchies. They were all abolished in 1918 after the German defeat. And those people, some of those royalists originally did support Hitler, but Hitler had no interest in any of their agenda. He had no interest in restoring any of the princes in any of the German states. So it would make sense, if you're a monarchist, to be against the Nazis. So it may be in his case, as when you ask, well, why doesn't he support Vichy then, rather than the Resistance? So it may be that he had come to the conclusion that Vichy was now so compromised through its collaboration with Hitler that basically, if you are an aristocrat or if you're a monarchist, you're already tainted by this. There's also a sense, and I think you do get, you do realize it in the film, is that, well, here, 1940, the French collapse. This basically, there's, no one's going to come and help France out. Certainly not the British. Um, so you have to essentially support Field Marshal Pétain, the great war hero, the great French patriot, and that's it. And Pétain absolutely kind of extols traditional French virtues, church, family, whatever. Though he also he's not restoring the French monarchy. Even Pétain doesn't want to restore the French monarchy. Um, so I think that makes sense. But the fortunes of the war began to change. So in 1941, we have the German defeat outside of Moscow, and then of course, February 1943, we have the massive German defeat in Stalingrad. So at that moment, I mean, if you're doing your calculations in France, whom do I support? You have to think the chances are Germany is going to lose this war. Therefore, it may not be such a great idea to be unconditional in your support for Germany. Now, of course, many did so. Many continued with for ideological reasons, continued with their support for Hitler, because the alternative was just so much more horrible, so much worse. Socialism and so on. But if you don't really think much of the Hitler ideology, you don't really think much of fascism. I mean, again, if you're a monarchist, you would find the Hitler ideology kind of disgusting. You might think this is the rabble. I mean, this is street corner stuff. Mobs on the streets beating up people, beating up Jewish shopkeepers. This is the rabble. Why would I want to associate myself with the rabble, particularly when you realize that it's quite likely this rabble is going to lose this war. So that's why I would have thought, it would make sense that you're going to choose from 1943 onwards was likely to be the winning team, which is the Resistance. And I think that's why I think so many more Frenchmen began joining the Resistance in 1943, not because German rule was so terrible, but by then they were realizing, hey, they knew which way the wind is blowing. It's not blowing from Berlin. So that's kind of how I would explain it. But yeah, absolutely, that they didn't like communism. But if you're thinking in terms of you said goal is socialism. I mean, I don't think anyone thought de Gaulle was a socialist. I mean, they were thinking, first of all, yes, you got the communist, but you have de Gaulle. De Gaulle would be seen as a kind of a conservative. He's a conservative person. And it was always quite likely that de Gaulle would be the leader of France after the war, which he was. He was the leader of France, but then, he stepped aside in 1946, and then he was out for 12 years. So, you join the Resistance, and you probably are thinking in terms of, yeah, you got these communists, you don't like the communists, but chances are, they won't necessarily be the ones who are going to win out in the power struggle. And the communists didn't win out. They were powerful in France, but the communists never won out. It was the kind of French conservatives or moderate conservatives who actually won out in France. Anyway, really, really interesting issues here. Anyway, and then Cynthia goes on, and people like French fascist leader Jacques Doriot equally puzzle me as well. How does someone go from being a committed communist to an equally committed fascist just because they decided communism had completely collapsed into Bolshevism? It seems far more reasonable to take the view of people like French Communist Party leader Jacques Duclos, that you could be a communist without being a Bolshevik. Do you have any thoughts on this? Well, I don't know. I don't know whether there was ever anyone who believed that you could be a communist without being a Bolshevik. I mean, I think that from 1917 on, pretty much all of the communists, everywhere, particularly in Europe, so all of the communists were followers of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In other words, it was like the church. This was a church. It was a very hierarchical system, and at the head of the system was the leader of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which of course was Stalin. I mean, it was Lenin, and then it was Stalin. So, and you had to follow the teachings of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. I mean, the doctrine, the orthodoxy that was handed down, all communists had to adhere to that doctrine. There couldn't be any deviation. I mean, it really was modeled on the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, basically, the word of the Pope has to be accepted by all congregants. You can't have, well, I have my own faith, I have my own theories about God and the incarnation. You don't. You just you have to follow the official teaching. That's the whole point of being in this church. If you don't want to follow the teachings of the Pope, the Holy Synod, then you have to go find yourself another religion. But you can't be a member of the Roman Catholic Church. So in the same way, with communism, is that you had to follow the doctrine that came down from Moscow, and that's why when Moscow changed its party line on a variety of things, when they they said that the Social Democrats were the main enemy, and they waged a war against the Social Democrats during the early 1930s. Then that changed. The new orthodoxy was that there should be a popular front of communists and the Social Democrats. Then the orthodoxy was this is a war among the capitalists between Nazi Germany and Britain and France. This is a war among the capitalists. This has nothing to do with the communists. So basically, hands off of the communists. Then, of course, the party line changed. The communists were now supporting the governments that were fighting Hitler, after 1941. I mean, they went through one iteration after another, but each time, all the communists had to follow the party line. However much it kept changing, over a 10-year period, the party line kept changing, but you had to do it because that was the doctrine as it came down from Moscow. So there was no real difference between communism and Bolshevism. Now, things did change many years after the war. When certain independent thinking was encouraged, well, not encouraged, but certain independent thinking was accepted. And so you no longer had the one communist orthodoxy handed down by Moscow. So you had Euro communism. I don't know whether anyone remembers that. So suddenly, you have the communists in France and Italy. They're different from the Moscows. So you had Enrico Berlinguer in Italy and Georges Marchais in France. They have they don't follow blindly Bolshevism. But at the time we're talking about, there's no difference between communism and Bolshevism. If you don't like the Bolsheviks, if you don't like what the Stalin was doing, you couldn't be a communist. I mean, it was an impossibility. You could be on the left, you could be a radical leftist, you could be an anarchist, you could be whatever you want, but you couldn't be a communist. If you're a communist at that time, you had to accept Stalin as your leader. You had to accept everything that he said as the gospel, and you couldn't deviate from that line. So that was then. I mean, as I say, it changed somewhat in the 1970s, when suddenly there was all sorts of different kinds. We have communists in China, we have communists in Romania. You know, they all have their own idea of communism, but not at that time. That was came later. Anyway, I don't know. I don't know if I answered your question. That's how I would answer it. Um, and let me look at this. Marty, always good to see you, Marty. Thank you so much, as always, for all of your generosity and all of your many hilarious memes. Even though I don't always know exactly. So I mean, they're looking. Yes, these are to these goggles. Macron, and I'm not exactly sure who is with Macron. I can't see him. You know that who's. I don't know, you have to enlighten me. I'm not exactly sure what that is. It looks quite horrific. Um, but yeah, that was you know. So if you could just tell us what exactly are we looking at? Um, and Summer Petrus, always good to see you. Summer Petrus, fluent Hungarian speaker, a frequent guest here, and a chemist, a scientist. I had studied chemistry many years ago, but I never stuck with that. But Summer Petrus did stick with it, and worked as a research chemist for many years. Very impressive. So thank you, Summer Petrus, for all of all of your generosity, and look forward to seeing you in Budapest. So thank you, and where are we? And yes, and he asks, are you able to divulge what brand of scotch you are slurping? Well, the scotch, I don't always drink scotch, but if I like, what brand of scotch do I normally drink? I normally drink, Lafroig, and and I have to say, the when it comes to Lafroig, my favorite is all of the ones that are peaty. I'm very much an Isle of Islay person, and so I really like my scotches very peaty. So it's Ardbeg, Lafroig, and Lagavulin. They're always my favorite scotches. Um, so I mean, but of course, you not all of the Isle of Islay scotches are peaty, but those are always my favorite. So as I say with Lafroig, you're going to make sure that you go for the peaty, the really peaty ones, but because you you might end up with a Lafroig, a very high quality Scotch, no question, high quality Scotch, but not necessarily peaty, if that's what you're looking for, which I am. But Ardbeg and Lagavulin are probably of a higher quality. Lagavulin in particular, higher quality than Lafroig. But those are really classy scotches. A little expensive, as really good scotches are. But so here I drink Lafroig, but my preference would be to drink Lagavulin. Anyway, thank you so much. NKMRD, for my taste, too many people I watched talking about this war were not very successful evaluating the conflict, and I watch both pro NATO and NATO critical content. Yep. The entire information field is as muddy as one would expect from a wartime. I prefer information to be very clear and accurate. Bad times for that. I agree with you, and I think that um, many people who are kind of ostensibly on our side, in the sense that they don't support the NATO line, are, however, very blinkered in their outlook. I mean, they spend almost all of their time declaring making all sorts of predictions and telling us at any moment that Ukraine is on the brink of collapse. Every time they come on, you know, Zelensky blows his nose, and that means Kiev is on the brink of collapse. Russia's on the brink of fantastic breakthroughs. Russia's on the brink of great victories, and they've been doing this for 4 years. And so, really, they're not really helping their audience. So, their audience wants informed commentary. Now, if you don't know, you don't know, and I think there's nothing wrong with not knowing. I think, as you say, wartime is very, very murky. You can't, we don't know what exactly is going on. Somebody captures a village. Well, is that significant? Well, not significant. Oh, well, they've captured, I don't know how many square miles during this month. Okay, fantastic. Does that actually advance your goals strategically? You can, capture any number of square miles, but it still doesn't really advance your strategic goals. So there's just too much of this commentary. I mean, the pro NATO uh, commenters, I just think are almost entirely worthless, and I don't take most of them very seriously. But the anti-NATO, all the people who we know all of them. We don't have to name their names. I don't take them very seriously either, because they're continually making predictions, which I think is a total waste of time. And then they just continue doing so. So I think the most useful way of doing these things is to analyze what goes on and try to gain an understanding of what is happening, and therefore, from the basis of what's happening, what trends, what tendencies can you see, and what's likely to develop. And we may be wrong. I mean, that can happen. But when you make these categorical predictions, and we know a lot of people making all sorts of predictions back in 2022, 2023, and we're so far from any of those predictions from coming true, then there's something wrong, and you're not really helping your listeners. And unfortunately, a lot of it is also driven by a grift. You can get a lot of eyeballs because people want to have their views confirmed, and so they go to certain people and they get their views confirmed, and that helps you make some money on YouTube. But that's, I don't know, to me that's a low level stuff. Just, hey, I want to get eyeballs so that I can get these huge numbers on YouTube. And how do I get huge numbers? Well, I tell them what they want to hear. To me, that's just it's not what alt media is supposed to be about. Just, hey, I can make money on YouTube. That's not the alt media, and no purpose. If you're going to go against the mainstream media, don't make all the egregious errors that the mainstream media have made, because they're also primarily driven by money. Anyway, thank you so much, NKMRD. Anne Marie, so nice to see you again. Really happy to you joined us. Anne Marie, so Happy New Year. And as I always say, Anne Marie's a distinguished musician, distinguished musical practitioner who, amazingly enough, has performed in some of the finest orchestras in the world, has worked with some of the best conductors and composers and musicians in the world, and, knows the classical music repertoire inside and out. There's almost, nothing that I can play or nothing that I can talk about that Anne-Marie doesn't really know far more than I do, and has played at the highest level. So I'm always just amazingly just so happy and flattered that Anne-Marie joins us and is part of our community. And of course, she even finds time to offer her observations and insights on the offerings of the Gaggle Music Club. So I'm really, really happy about that, really appreciate that. She's been doing this really now, I don't know for how long, and it's essentially built up into a very solid body of work. And so, thank you, Anne Marie, for doing that. Thank you for being part of the community, and look forward to enjoying more of your informed commentary, as only a musical professional can provide in the coming years. So thank you, Anne Marie. And NK D says, when I look at VDL von der Leyen, I simply don't believe that woman will step back and leave Putin and Trump to play the game. It doesn't feel like it. No, absolutely right. No, there's no way the Europeans are just going to stand back and allow this to be resolved, this war to be resolved peacefully. It's not going to happen. This war isn't going to be resolved peacefully, because there are too many interests that want to keep this war going. And the Europeans, and particularly von der Leyen, who has turned the EU into essentially the political arm of the of NATO. This is her life. This is her passion. She doesn't care about anything else. She has no interest in anything else. You never hear her talk about anything else other than Ukraine. That's what she's about. Von der Leyen, Macron, Merz. Just look at them. They are not just going to end this war. They're not going to sit down and be ready to sign any kind of an agreement. They want this war to continue, and they will do whatever it needs to keep it going, including plotting against Trump, trying to overthrow Trump. They tried it before during his first term. They'll continue doing so. During the whatever impeachments take place after the midterms, the Europeans are going to be helping the Democrats with their impeachment. So thank you. Robert, always very good to see you. Robert is, of course, a learned philosopher, a political thinker, always kind of raises the tone of discussions on a more intellectual, more abstract level. So thank you so much, Robert. Thank you for your generosity over the past year. Really appreciate it. Happy New Year. And then Robert says, Hobbes, this Thomas Hobbes, warned that without the state, we would face a war of all against all. Yep. And yet here we are, surrounded by states such as Russia and Ukraine, Israel, Iran, and Lebanon, the United States, China, and Taiwan, India, and Pakistan, each intact, sovereign, and in conflict. Was Hobbes premature in taking absence of the state for the problem? Well, it's very interesting. Hobbes essentially believed that when it comes to individuals could not survive without essentially surrendering their power to the state. So in other words, that they had to, in order to survive, in order to be protected against their fellow man, they essentially had to accept really the absolute power of the state. Because without the state, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. There's another one that's missing. Nasty, solitary, brutish, and short. That's nasty, solitary, brutish, and short. So the only way you can avoid life being nasty, solitary, brutish, and short is through by surrendering your power to the state. But that only works on a national level. So when it comes to nation states, you don't get to you don't get to pick and choose whether you're going to have a government ruling over you. It's part of when you enter into the political community, you enter into the contract, you have to accept it. You have to accept the authority of the state. But that only applies within states. It has never applied against. It's never applied to the international community. So the international community is still fairly anarchic. It's not as anarchic as it used to be, but it's still fairly anarchic. So they kind of tried to set up some analogy of the state through the League of Nations, originally after World War One. So hey, if we have a state domestically, why can't we have a kind of international state so that that would prevent um, countries from going to war against one another? And so those were the ideas reigning after World War One. I mean, not just because of the League of Nations, but then you had the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It was in the 1920s, in which countries would voluntarily abjure the use of force. Would say, well, I am never going to trying to secure my interest by the use of force. So it's kind of similar to what you have domestically. You're not allowed to use force other than to defend yourself. No, and even then, whatever force you use must be proportionate to the threat you face. So that was that. But the League of Nations obviously failed, and so now then they came up with a more complicated version of the League of Nations. So they avoided the pitfalls of the League of Nations, and they created this two-tier system of the United Nations, whereby you have the UN Security Council, which is ruled over by the great powers, and then you have the rest, which is the General Assembly, who's that everybody's a member, but their views really don't count. But you have to follow the rulings of the Security Council, and it's kind of worked up to a point, but it's still an anarchic system. But the only reason, however, it survives is it because of its undemocratic nature. Its undemocratic nature is that it prioritizes the great powers. In other words, the great powers are allowed to do things, and they gives them leeway to do things that other states are not allowed to do. And because they're great powers, no one messes with them. So that was the kind of the genius of the United Nations. They worked on it during World War II so as to avoid all the mistakes of the League of Nations. And so it's still anarchic, but at least it survived. The League of Nations really, was out of business within 20 years, but the United Nations has survived. So anyway, that's just a long-winded way of saying that no one has yet figured out an international version of the domestic system, whereby everybody accepts some overarching state. And that's largely because there's such inequality among the powers. With individuals, everybody's more or less equal. Not entirely true, obviously, because when the differences in economic power means you have a great deal more power than others within a domestic system. But in the international system, you get the United States. The United States isn't going to allow, some shithole country, as Trump would put it, shithole country, to tell it what it can do. So the United States says, we're not going to have an international criminal court. We're not going to have anything to do with that. Well, okay, you just have to accept it. And then Russia says, we're not going to have anything to do with the international criminal court either. China says, well, we're not going to have anything to do with that. India, we're not going to have anything to do with that. Well, of course not, because they're great powers, and they're not going to be constrained by courts. And even when you got something that's not a criminal court, like the International Court of Justice, the United States says we're not going to be bound by the rulings of the International Court of Justice. We don't care. You don't have jurisdiction over us. Somebody else, they have to accept the rulings of the ICJ. The United States isn't. That's not obligated to do that. So I think you do need the state domestically. I think I do agree with Hobbes that without government, without the rule of law, life will be nasty, solitary, brutish, and short. I just don't think that you can apply that on the international level. And anyone who has tried to it has always failed. But anyway, Robert, there's food for thought. There's a lot to think about. So thank you for your observation there. Where are we? Okay, then we NKMRD simply okay, right, Freudian. Okay, Robert says Cynthia is absolutely right that the film is as much an industrial as an artistic production. Yep, that's right, exactly right. And people always get that wrong. It's an industrial thing. It's not. It's not like a novel. Novel, yeah, you're the writer. You made the novel. It's yours from start to finish. Painting, yeah, it's yours. Sculpture, yeah, yours. But you really can't say the director. A film is the work of the director. It's just there's so many people who are involved. I mean, you just look at so particularly in the case of the French. The French kind of extolled Alfred Hitchcock was their model because they said, well, every Alfred Hitchcock film it has a distinctive Hitchcockian imprimatur. You say you basically, hey, you can recognize a Hitchcockian film, but even if that were true about Hitchcock, it doesn't apply to most other film directors. But even when you look at the Hitchcock, I mean, all of the things that are involved in a Hitchcock movie. I mean, the music, the screenplay, which Hitchcock never wrote the screenplay. I mean, there's very clever screenplays. The editing, all of that, the location findings, and so on. I mean, it's a complicated process. Anyway, and then Robert says Anthony Sutton. Was that Anthony Sutton the one I'm thinking about? The one who wrote about the Wall Street and the Bolsheviks. That it may be Anthony Sutton. He wrote about that in the 1970s. That may be the book I'm thinking of. Anthony Sutton. Anthony Sutton wrote about the Bolsheviks and the West, apparently mistaking the NEP and the invitation of Albert Kahn to set up industry as a Wall Street collusion. Yeah, so it may have been Sutton that he was. So much of this whole thesis about Wall Street bankrolling the Bolsheviks, I think, derives from this one book. And because there was just one, he had this one Wall Street guy who apparently, I wasn't even a particularly important Wall Street guy. I've forgotten his, the surname began with F. Can't remember his name, but somehow he was really responsible for the Bolsheviks. But as I say, if you really want to go, who brought the Bolsheviks to power, then it would be Alexander Helphand in Germany. But yeah, Anthony Sutton may be the writer I'm thinking of. And KMRD said the Nazis were a much less uniform group than many people think nowadays. It's well worth digging into what the different personalities were interested in. I agree. I mean, you had the SA guys, the Ernst Röhm, who we were again very different. A lot of homosexuality there, obviously, but some of them had absolutely very much socialist ideas. And of course, you had many people around Hitler who were capitalists and had no time for the socialists. And then of course you had the conservatives who had all sorts of conservative ideas, social conservatism, which Hitler pretended to be interested in, but it wasn't. In the end, what we see in Germany right now is partly rooted in that time. When you would live here, you could see it. You could see how many things that haven't been established by parts of the Nazi movement are established now. That's very interesting. It's that's very observant and very interesting. And then NKM, this is all people can tell you things you never get to hear in the media. We should all work in nursery homes if we were serious about the work. I guess there can't be many people left alive now in Germany who have a living memory of those days. I mean, it's 80 years. I mean, you have to be almost in your mid 90s to have a living memory of that time. Robert says a handy mnemonic is you drink scotch while talking to Scots about scotching ties. About scotching ties. um, to the UK. Yes, that's a new yes, a very nice mnemonic. Um, and Marty says Klaus, Klaus. That's it. Yeah, Klaus enjoying his retirement and plugging his new book. That's yeah, exactly. I forgot about him. Yeah, he's kind of faded away, Klaus Schwab. Um, that's it. So let me. Marty's got a link here. Let me click onto the link. Um, where is it? It's not coming up. Okay, coming up now. Taking a bit slow. Klaus Schwab, as the year comes to a close, I want to reflect on how longer lives are reshaping society, on how longer lives are reshaping society, an issue at the heart of my latest book. Oh, this is a book about how rich people are going to live to 150. Well, that's so nice. It's a real problem. What are we going to do? We rich people are going to live to 150. Longevity and Retirement in the Intelligent Age is available from major online booksellers. Okay, all right. Yeah, well, I'm not gonna. That's the book from Gene Therapy. Oh God, yeah, all right. Thank you, thank you for that. So that's so he's flogging this new book. I see, and then um, and then here's Emmanuel Macron. Let me click on this. God, Emmanuel Macron. Oh, this is show translation. So the joys and sorrows, successes and challenges, hopes, looking back on 2025 in France and around the world, guaranteed without immersive reality. So it's kind of what is he doing? Is he looking into a kaleidoscope? Oh God. Um. Oh, yeah. Well, it's one of those things that I'm not exactly thinking about this living to 150. I mean, I think maybe in 50 years' time, there'll be some people living to 120, 130. I can't see the great pleasure in doing that. I mean, if you got money, you can live to 120, but what's the pleasure of living to that age when all your friends are now dead, your parents are dead, your children are dead, probably even your grandchildren are dead. I don't know what. It doesn't seem like very much fun. Um, but I also don't see that as anything that more than what very very rich people are going to be able to afford. Um, it all kind of reminds me of the sort of the anguish that it was in the 1960s, this fashionable idea that we're all going to be living for leisure. There's not going to be enough work to do, and we're just going to enjoy leisure. And the problem was, hey, well, what are we going to do in our leisure hours? Apparently there's going to be no work to do. And gosh, hey, this is a real problem. People are not going to know what to do with their lives. It never happened that way. There's always, no one can afford to live for leisure, and all the guff about robots and whatever. And that goes back to the 60s. Somehow we're going to robots are going to do our work for us. So long before AI. That never happened, and it was never likely to happen. Same with this thing about living to 150, even if it were desirable. But thank you. Typical that it's a typical issue that Klaus Schwab would take up. The guy who advocated eating bugs. Yeah, we should be eating bugs and not meat. Anyway, Anne Marie says, I'm very sorry for being late with my comments on your last two musical posts, but I just have too much going on. No, absolutely do not worry. There's no pressure, no deadlines or whatever. So whenever you have a moment, please contribute. But there's, just the very fact that you're here with us is always a great honor for us, and we're always learning. When you do have time to make your musical comments, we all learn something about music. And and Anne Marie says, what do you think of that new embassy which the Americans are building in Lebanon, which allegedly will be far bigger than the usual embassy? It seems that it is a kind of a military base. Some questions why the U.S. needs a sizable embassy in a nation with barely 6 million inhabitants. The complex will be surrounded by concrete walls and barbed wire fences, leading to comparison with a military base. Well, I think that's part of the American projection of power. So, Trump or no Trump, we keep hearing about how America is retrenching, America was withdrawing, but it never happens. I mean, when was it that America was planning to leave Syria? Well, that hasn't happened. Trump was threatening to do it. What was it, 2018, 7 years ago? That's not happening. On the contrary, he's extending the stay in Syria. So same with Lebanon. Lebanon is kind of a prime real estate, and what's the game now? Well, the game now is we need to prevent China from getting a foothold in the Levant, and so therefore the justification for a major presence in Syria, major presence in Lebanon, because China. So back in the Cold War, it was had to stop the Soviet Union. Now we have to stop China. Whenever the Americans build any of these embassies, they're always grotesquely too big and grotesquely alien to the immediate environment. I mean, it's almost like they go out of their way to impose some horrific eyesore that no one can approach, and no one can complain about. Here in Budapest, the U.S. embassy is on Szabadság tér, Freedom Plaza, and it's a beautiful plaza. But why is it so ugly now? Well, because the U.S. embassy is there, and there's no way you can get around it. I mean, it's like boom, it's there, and of course, it has all of the security barriers keeping the rabble away from getting even close to the embassy. So there it is. I mean, why does it need it in a supposedly friendly country like Hungary? But that is, we can build an embassy here and keep everybody out, and don't even think about complaining about, hey, this was a beautiful square before you moved in here. So it's this is just par for the course with the Americans. But leaving aside why they now see every part of the Middle East as a prime real estate to keep China at bay. Anyway, I've gone on for too long, but it's it's special day today. It's the last solo live stream of the 2025. Next time we meet, which will be on Thursday, New Year's Day, it'll be 2026. It's going to be saying, well, 2026. All right. So thank you for this year. Thank you for today. Thank you for all your comments and questions and suggestions. Thank you for everyone who's contributed, mightily to our pages. People who have, posted, jokes and memes and fascinating anecdotes and fascinating kind of insights into popular culture and even serious culture. Thank you for all of that. And thank you for all the informed postings. Thank you, obviously, to Cynthia and Anne-Marie for their artistic postings, Robert for all of your intellectual musings. So thank you all. And if the dogs were here, they wouldn't thank you, but I'm speaking on their behalf. Thank you for your contributions. See you on Thursday. Happy New Year. All the best. Bye bye.